welcome back. It's lovely to see you again on day 2 of the Elevating the Debate on Decentralization and Multi-Level Governance in Africa workshop organized by LPSA and its partners, Dula Omar Institute, EALGA, the Institute of Local Governance Studies in Ghana. It's really been a pleasure to have you here. So today we have an exciting day, building on yesterday's conversations that we already started. The first session will be moderated by Paddy, but before Paddy comes in, we had a small clip, although it is in Swahili. I hope a lot of us by now can speak Swahili. In the meantime, as we set up, we have 2 new guests joining us today. I'd like to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. Maybe we can start with Con. Sorry to put you on the spot.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Con Osendo, based here in Nairobi, Kenya. Just transitioned last week from FCDO Nairobi after 8 years, where I was leading the devolution program across Kenya and doing a lot of the political economy work. So it's good to be here with all of you, and asante sana.
We have Mukapa Temba. Thank you, Con, for joining us.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tembo Mukapa. I'm from the Ministry of Local Government in Zambia, specifically the Chalimbana Local Government Training Institute. Thank you very much.
Apologies for KQ. Allow me to apologize for KQ. He started his journey on Sunday and only got here yesterday evening, just across 2 countries or so. We are happy to have you. Thank you, Mukapa. Maybe we can try it again. Let's see if it works. Thank you.
Ni kwa vuguvugu moja linaloshinikiza uongozi bora katika eneo la kusini mwa jangwa la Sahara barani Afrika limetaja ufisadi wa ukosefu wa utaalamu kuwa tishio kubwa kwa mfumo wa ugatuzi barani humo. Kwenye mkutano wao jijini Nairobi, wanachama wa vuguvugu hilo walidai kuwa ikiwa maovu hayo mawili hayatakomeshwa, basi sera za kuafikia mabadiliko katika magatuzi hazitazaa matunda.
Kenya inaingia kwenye kipindi cha miaka 11 ya mfumo wa ugatuzi tangu kuratibishwa kwa katiba ya mwaka 2010. Na licha ya mafanikio makubwa yaliyopatikana magatuzini, wengi wanahisi serikali za kaunti zimenaswa katika lindi la ufisadi na mapendeleo.
That journey is a journey with complexities, with serious challenges. Challenges which are political, challenges which are social, challenges which have to do with economics, challenges of not having sufficient technical people with enough technical and professional competences.
Corruption and maladministration and lack of expertise is always the Achilles heel of devolution. That's why it's important that national governments support devolution and make sure that skills are built, capacity is built, and also that there is monitoring and supervision, that if there is mischief in the counties, that there are mechanisms for that mischief to be addressed.
Maovu hayo yametajwa na harakati wa vuguvugu moja linalodadisi uongozi, mfumo wa ugatuzi barani Afrika kuwa kikwazo kikuu kwa juhudi za bara hili kuvuna matunda yanayotokana na ugatuzi. Vuguvugu hilo limekuwa likifuatilia mafanikio ya ugatuzi na limesema kuwa ufisadi na ukosefu wa utaalamu vinapaswa kushughulikiwa, kwani hakuna mafanikio yatakayo nakiliwa.
The end result of this conference is to come up with practical, not theoretical, practical ideas. How those processes can be achieved and how they are achieved in a way in which everybody is involved.
And we are here to bring together experts, practitioners, scholars, to compare notes about devolution, decentralization, and how that can be used to improve development, democracy, and peace on the African continent. And it's not a coincidence that we're having this in Kenya, because Kenya is one of the countries on the continent with the most ambitious devolution program.
Mkutano wa Nairobi unanuia kubadilishana maarifa na kutambua mbinu ambazo zitawezesha bara hili kupata suluhisho la kudumu kwa minajili ya kufanikisha ugatuzi.
Yeah, but to take the conversation further on a bit of a recap, I'll hand over to Paddy to take us through the next session. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Good morning, everyone. Habari ya asubuhi. Jambo, jambo. So just testing the Swahili again. I think yesterday was a packed day. I don't know how you felt after digesting all the inputs that we got, not just from the different presenters in the sessions that we had yesterday, in the opening remarks that were shared, but also from the very interactive discussion that we had and the inputs that came through. So before I attempt to give what I think was a summary of what I was hearing, we just thought to take a bit of a temperature check in the room of what is still burning with you. I know some may have not been with us yesterday, but maybe you had a look at the agenda, also speaking to Kon and Mukupa and saying, feel free also to come in later and also share. But for those who were here, what is still left there is for us to just take a pause. If there was anything that you thought needed to be said yesterday that you didn't get the chance to, and after a good breakfast today, you said, that point. Silence means further digestion, as I learned somewhere, and not consent. So maybe I will give a quick recap. I mean, we started yesterday with the motivators and influences for how to sustain the decentralization agenda, and we also had a moment to kind of look into what the key points and the key points around service delivery that were linked to economic ambitions that local governments should be vested in. We also touched on sort of effective urban planning in a contextualized, with a call to have a contextualized approach that also had inclusivity at the core. It was also very interesting to just hear and I guess appreciate the conceptual clarity on devolution and decentralization in Africa, because these things mean different things to different people. We also had a very good discussion, I think, that came through in different parts of the discussions yesterday on how do we essentially explore issues on good data, on measurement. We listened on diagnostic tools, and we also questioned ourselves, is it time maybe for another diagnostic tool, and what would that be, and who would it serve? In terms of elevating the debate that we have on decentralization in Africa. Then we had a very interesting dive into localizing the SDGs and questioning ourselves, is that a useful entry point to elevating the debate? But then also hearing from European experience on what lessons have been useful for them and practical in their, was it 100-year journey, Boris? 1,000 years journey, I missed a zero, on how, how do you sort of have a formal coordination of stakeholders that can contribute. In this case, we heard from Boris speaking to us of, European, local and regional governments' contribution to the EU's development and, of course, the international frameworks from that perspective. So what could we learn and, what useful lessons come across as we are crafting our own? And we will hear that in a bit from some of the speakers. It was also interesting to have sort of this back of our minds, the charter, it came up several times, the African Charter on Decentralization. And Boris also managed to just nose in a bit and say, hey, can I make a light comparison there? So it was really interesting to hear these perspectives as well. So looking again at this continental level. But I think what also triggered more importantly is then with all this that we heard yesterday, and with the setting and of the local public sector alliance, how do we then, through the different structures, particularly the sub-working groups, the thematic working groups, how can we be that knowledge broker on sort of practical issues around decentralization? That really make this comparison, if you want to, legal frameworks that are available but seem to be lacking from the practical implementation side. How can we use this in terms of exploring models for effective service delivery and extending that in areas where we don't see local governments having an interest in their participation in economic growth setting, and indeed other topical issues, but also not just looking at it from a country perspective, really understanding what we can learn across countries on the continent, and sort of, move away from just listing out best practices, but really looking at what I would sort of term kind of, the cherry picking of elements in best practices that can be contextualized in different settings as far as sustaining the decentralization agenda is. And so, of course, a lot of all this has been spoken about in the multi-level governance ecosystem. Very important to understand the different partnerships that are around the table. And so, in a nutshell, this was kind of my take. And I don't know if after saying this, someone else would just like to add on something we may have missed. Also, just to let you know that there will be a report coming out at some point. So there's also always an opportunity for us to engage further. I am conscious of time. I think we would like to dive in and maybe just to say hello to people joining us online. We know that some have been there yesterday with us, joining and following on some of the very interesting debates that we had. We didn't hear much from the Zoom room, but we also understand, when you're not physically sitting in a room, sometimes it's not that easy to engage. But today, we will have the privilege to have speakers joining us from the Zoom room, which will be shown out on the screen. And we also encourage that the chat can be a place in which you could, for those joining us online, put in your thoughts, your reflections, your questions, your interesting contexts and papers that have been written, or other work as people are sharing. We're taking a turn with the first session this morning on looking at decentralization in Africa. And we have packed the day in a way that we will look at it from different perspectives. The discussion will continue this afternoon, but this morning we're going to particularly look at two perspectives. One is the perspective from federal context, so we will hear from Ethiopia and Nigeria. And then we will move on a little later to hear perspectives from Francophone countries, from Francophone Africa, to be very specific. And for the first session, kicking off just to make sure we have our discussant, I think he's coming on a little bit later. Chris Okeke from Nigeria will be joining us online. Steve Ogutu, who is here in the room, and I will give our speakers the privilege to also just briefly introduce yourselves. And Katema Wakira. I have to know how to pronounce that better in Amharic. Wakijira. Yes, perfect. And so just to set off, as we take this deep dive, Ketema, maybe you just wanted to share with us your reflections. For the speakers, we have a clock here with us in the room, and we are giving them 15 minutes. And I hear that the clock looks very different in Ethiopia, so you could interpret that for however minutes that is. I understand you haven't even reached 2020, so let us know how you avoid COVID when you arrive there. On that, Katema, I invite you to share with us the decentralization perspective from Ethiopia. The floor is yours.
Okay. Good morning, all. I'm really glad to speak on this platform. And in order to use the time that is given to me, I directly go to my presentation. As it is rightly said, yes, it was an insightful, we had an insightful discussion yesterday, and I will try to connect my presentation to the same purpose of the conference. To start with the context, I think I have shared the slide. Yeah. To start with the context, Ethiopia introduced decentralization in 1990s, and this decentralization was brought to serve as a compromise between the forces of disintegration or forces that were claiming for complete self-determination and between the centralized unitary state. And decentralization was therefore from the start as a compromise for disintegration and centralization. It was in fact brought to end civil war and violent conflicts in the country previously, and also to create harmonious inter-ethnic relationship and equality between ethnic groups, diverse ethnic groups in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a diverse country with more than 80 ethnic communities. So mainly the decentralization was brought to respond to identity-related questions. We call it nationality questions, and also to ensure sustainable peace and development, and also as the end attain one economic and political community. So the genesis of federalization, decentralization project was principally identity-based. Efficiency and effectiveness of public policy was not the original intent of decentralization. It's good to mention this. With that, the first phase of decentralization was for 1 decade from 1991 to 200, and that focused very much on responding to ethnic self-rule, ethnic diversity accommodation, and the granting of self-rule for ethnic communities. With that framework, the country created 9 regional states and 12, now it is increased to 12 regional states, and also zonal structure created within that framework, and local governments principally meant for administrative and also for ethnic self-rule for very small ethnic communities. But the problem in the first phase decentralization was that local governments were subordinate, and there was too much focus on ethnic issues than public and development matters. That latter brought the ruling regime to redesign the decentralization, and that brought the system to the second phase of decentralization, which started in the 2001. That second phase of decentralization mainly focuses on 2 approaches. One is district level decentralization, and the second is local urban management program. So the second phase of decentralization tried to respond to poverty, underdevelopment, and it shifted the identity focus of decentralization process to poverty reduction projects and programs. In fact, this was a conscious selection or choice of the ruling party to align with MDG and poverty reduction programs by then. But the problem, however, remained the same. The second decentralization didn't attain much of what it promised. So, as a policy solution, for the interest of time, in Ethiopia, to bring effective and inclusive decentralization that goes hand in hand with democratization, sustainable peace and development, there should be a future consideration. And these future considerations are put in the following manner. First, there is still lack of national consensus and the political settlement when it comes to decentralization and federalization project in Ethiopia. And that brings us to go to the basics, like we said yesterday. You know, people are still debating which form of decentralization, which form of federalization model fits to the Ethiopian context, and there is lack of consensus on the model and the type of decentralization that fits to Ethiopia. Some say the ethnic model, the existing one, fits to the Ethiopian context. Others say yes to the federalization and decentralization project, but there must be some kind of refocusing the decentralization project and somehow reducing the overemphasis on identity issues and so on and so on. Looking into the Kenyan case, from what I have heard yesterday and previously, Kenya's success in this regard, for me, it seems that from the start, the devolution project was a broad consensus-based, and there was a political agreement on the project, and that has, I think, contributed to the success of Kenyan case, but this is really lacking in the Ethiopian context. Another point of focus in the relation to the Ethiopian system is that the local governments are still subordinate, although the constitution says that local governments shall be established and adequate autonomy shall also be granted to them. However, constitutional recognition of local government is not explicit, and there is a lack of institutional security for the existence of the structure and boundary of local government in the Ethiopian context. And also, the national government or the federal government lacks clear vision as to what kind of local government should exist in Ethiopian case. The other important issue is lack of adequate autonomy, because contrary to the constitutional promise, there is a mismatch between functional responsibility and capacity of local government. And local governments lack freedom to choose their political leader, and they are fiscally dependent on the center or the regional states. There is also a problem of accountability, participation, and rule of law. And although the big problem in Ethiopia, the big problem in the local government related issue in Ethiopia is lack of accountability and the rule of law. And the local government is shoulder burden of two accountabilities: accountability to the senior government and accountability to the electorates or the community. And the upward accountability is fairly working well, but the downward accountability or the accountability to the community is not working very well. And the interest of the community is neglected, I would say. So there is a problem of accountability, participation, and the rule of law. The other point that I want to emphasize is the issue of intergovernmental relation. Recently, the Ethiopian government enacted a new proclamation, that is the Intergovernmental Relation Proclamation. This proclamation tries to create institutions and forums for vertical and horizontal relations, but the local government space is missing. There is no recognition for the participation of local government in these intergovernmental forums on both horizontal and vertical line. And the top leaders are really not interested very much in institutionalizing the intergovernmental relation, because they are comfortable with the third-party channel-based kind of communication on both vertical and horizontal dimension of the system. Another very important area of focus, which could also feed to the interest of LPSA, is that policy-oriented decentralization and multi-level governance is very important. You know, much of the discussion on decentralization and multi-level governance focuses on very systemic and holistic issues, but policy-oriented, sector-specific decentralization and multi-level governance is what is important, as I am speaking from the Ethiopian case. Mostly, public policies like education, health, have been well taken in relation to how the decentralization works, but other important policy matters like land, which is very critical in the Ethiopian case, water supply, electricity, and telecommunication are not very much emphasized. I think these are very important policy areas to take up for the future initiatives in relation to land policy and how decentralization works in this areas of public policy. Another point that I want to mention is inclusiveness and urban development. You know, the Ethiopian system, which I must mention, is that it has created correspondence between ethnic right and territorial autonomy. So there is ethnicization of the territory and also territorializing of the ethnicity. And that has created a problem in the urban areas where there are complex, diverse communities living in a specified urban space. So you could see ineffective management of diversity in the urban areas, but from the start, the ruling party emphasized very much on the rural development than the urban areas. And it was also criticized that the ruling party very much focused on the urban by taking its route to the peasantry and the social base from the rural. So there is imbalanced attention to the urban and rural development. So the issues of creating mutual linkages between urban and local government in the discussion of the decentralization could be very important point to take for the future. And also, from the start, decentralization system / democratization, federalization system in Ethiopia promised to end conflicts and to respond to violent and root causes of conflict. However, we have recently seen that federalization and the decentralization project has become part of the problem of conflict than really addressing the real issues. And this has brought debate on decentralization as to how it is related to peace building and internal displacement. So some say the problem is in the design. Some say there is a lack of implementation. Some say there is no mutual exclusion between design and implementation. Some say this cause of conflict in Ethiopia goes beyond the decentralization and federalization issue. So this brings us to how decentralization could mitigate conflict from its root, and what should be done to really resolve a conflict from its root in the context like Ethiopia, whether decentralization really mitigates the conflict or exacerbates this conflict is the real issue to discuss about. Another important point is the issue of associations and civil society organizations. In Ethiopia, we don't have local government association at regional level, but there is one association at the national level, which is facilitated by the federal government and other stakeholders like City Alliance and World Bank and also GIZ, that is a city association or Ethiopian Cities Association, which primarily focuses on experience sharing, improving public service and so on. But this is not, for one thing, it is not independent. For the other thing, it is not the responsibility of federal government to take after this association. They are not free. They can't do matters on their own terms. Finally, debate on decentralization very much focuses on legal, political, and financial matters. But the cultural foundation of decentralization in a given context is also very important. In Ethiopia, we have good institutions, and we have been making also reforms after reforms, but the cultural aspect is still where it was. I mean, we remain true to the authoritarian political culture, true to the unitary political tradition, and there is a mismatch between constitutional principles and political processes as a result of this. So it is therefore good to somehow link decentralization with political culture, cultural analysis of decentralization and how to bring supportive political culture for a decentralization to be inclusive and effective is something to consider for us. With that, I end. Thank you very much.
Ketema, thank you so much for sharing with us and just as a note, Katema is an assistant professor and head of the Center for Federalism and Governance Studies at the Addis Ababa University. We are in luck that we also have one of our panelists who is joining us super early in the morning. Good morning, Chris, in Nigeria. We know you probably, I hope you have had a cup of coffee or tea, but really privileged that you could be able to join us this morning. And just checking if we could have him on screen as we introduce Chris, who is a senior governance advisor at FCDO in Nigeria. Chris, can you hear us?
Good morning, all. Pleased to be here, and I hope you can hear me.
Loud and clear. The floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So when I had a conversation with Jenny on this conversation, it wasn't quite clear to me initially what angle to come from, partly because the decentralization conversation in Nigeria is actually on the front burner as we speak, particularly around the constitutional amendment process. But also there are a number of significant challenges and issues around decentralization in Nigeria. And so we decided that perhaps it would be useful to focus this conversation around some of the examples that we've seen that has helped key stakeholders to improve their capacity around how subnational governments, in particular, they've been able to move the needle around decentralization. So a lot of the points I would make in this conversation would dwell on, maybe 3 or 4 examples of how we have been able to move the needle around decentralization and how that has helped in the improvement of service delivery. We are not there yet. We have significant challenges, but that's what I would dwell on. So a little bit around the context of Nigeria. So maybe I'll spend maybe 2 minutes or so talking about the context of Nigeria, because that provides the basic background in terms of where we are today on decentralization in Nigeria. And by the way, good to see my brother and friend Con. Hi, Con. And so the Nigerian context. So we have a multi-level federal system with the federal government fully in charge, basically, and state government. We have 36 state governments at the subnational and 774 local governments. And the sizes of the local government and state governments differ. So, for example, you get Lagos State or Kano State, for example, that have about 20 million people in terms of population, and smaller state like Bayelsa with 2 million. Or another local government, maybe Alimosho in Lagos State, that has about 2 million people, for example, and a small local government in the south of the country that has about 40,000. So it differs, and the challenges differ. However, the key challenge around that is that the state governments in particular are fully devolved, well, not fully devolved, are devolved to a limited extent. So they have the capacity to make laws, collect taxes, take decisions, have a parliament. However, they are still dependent on fiscal transfers from the federal government, for example. Whereas the local government in Nigeria, they have little or no autonomy, but they still perform and still have authority to deliver some things like collection of taxes around markets, setting up of markets and things like that. So the key challenge and the key conversations we've been having in Nigeria in the past, perhaps, let's say 25 years since the return to democracy in 1999 has been how to better devolve power to the state government. And then there's another conversation around how do we ensure that local governments that are closer to the people get to deliver on some key essential services as stated in the Constitution. Both the state and the local government, and let me just say subnational government, have been under tremendous pressure in the past 15 years. And this has been the real basis for pressure, for demand for decentralization around Nigeria. So, from 2020, for example, to 2015, we had a growth of about 7%. But since 2015, GDP growth rate has been about 2% or thereabout. Population growth has been almost 3% per annum. You have about 46% of Nigerian population that living under poverty, an additional 23% of the population that are food insecure. Adding to that mix is the issue of insecurity with key challenges from non-state actors like Boko Haram, which I'm sure many of you have heard, or other groups around the country and bandits around the country. So with this and a lot of ungoverned spaces around the country because of the absence of local authority, there has been greater demand really for powers to be devolved to local government to deliver essential services. So in the past 15 years or so, how have we done it? And what are the key examples that have helped us to at least move the needle a little bit in terms of service delivery and provide better data around how subnational government, subnational level of government, they are governed? To say this, and let me start by saying this, I think someone mentioned this yesterday, we need to recognize that decentralization is political and is grounded in national politics and such. So whatever decision or solutions we come up with must be grounded in the national politics of it. And the way, for example, in FCDO, we have tried to support decentralization has been around understanding some of the key contexts and challenges. For me, the starting point really is about building coalitions. And I say this slowly, building coalitions around the key actors and stakeholders. So from the civil society partners in Nigeria and associations of, in Nigeria, we have local association of local government in Nigeria. They are key players around the decentralization conversation, and Nigerian Governors Forum. I think the lesson we've learned is that if you don't have this key partnership, your conversation or advocacy around decentralization it will probably take root, but it will take a longer time. But when you build this strong coalition around these partners, that would enable you to power the pressure, particularly at the federal level, to ensure that issues of constitutional amendment process, for example, would be able to move in a short time rather than in a long time. And a key example we've had is supporting the Nigerian Governors Forum, which is Nigerian Governors Forum is an association of governors, the 36 state governors in Nigeria. But for me, really, it's not just about having association of subnational governments to push the conversation around decentralization. It's about a capable technical association that is able to carry out research, that is able to base its advocacy around evidence. And that's very key when I come to the conversation around data transparency and how, for example, the Nigerian Governors Forum, they have been able to set up a data system that enables civil society partners, citizens, researchers to go into a portal, to go into a database that would critically analyze how budget or funds are expended and ask questions around that. That is particularly key in terms of how we move that conversation and how we hold subnational government accountable. For me, decentralization without accountability really amounts to a suboptimal achievement in terms of our decentralization. So when we're having a conversation around decentralization and devolving authority to the subnational government, it's important that we're building accountability mechanism around that approach to ensure that we're able to hold the subnational government accountable. And so we started the journey of we being FCDO, and this is a case study, of building a database on public financial management system to support the national subnational government. And the key challenge we had was that around the country, there was no real data to support policy making. There was no real data to support reform around public financial management. So we started with working with the Nigerian Governors Forum and building database for about 4 states in Nigeria. This was about 8-10 years ago, and we succeeded in that. However, what we've done is that, and this was the point I was making about the capacity or capability of the association, is that we have now transferred this database management system to the Nigerian Governors Forum over 10 years ago. Recently, last year, a new database, enhanced database, now has a comprehensive data in terms of around the admin segment of the budget, economic segment of the budget, and functional segment, and program segment, so that you can interrogate and compare data from different subnational governments in Nigeria, particularly the state government. And this has enabled civil society organizations, for example, to query and interrogate what level of expenditure has happened at the subnational level and hold them accountable to it. The other element is around the constitutional amendment process and building coalitions around the constitutional amendment process. If you remember earlier, I talked about the pressures on subnational governments to deliver. And so there has been a push around constitutional amendment to increase their authority. For example, the subnational governments in Nigeria, they don't have state police. They've only recently had the authority to provide power. Power had always been a central challenge. So on the state police, because of the security challenges, you've now had the need to have coalitions and conversations around constitutional amendment process to support that. But the key issue and focus for me here around constitutional amendment that is possible in Nigeria, we've had 5 alteration or changes to the constitution since 1999, which means that it is possible to devolve additional power or authority to subnational government through the constitutional amendment process, but it is very political. And how do you deliver that? You deliver that through engagement and influencing key actors around the constitutional amendment, the National Assembly, the presidency, the state governors, for example, and key politicians to ensure that they all come on board. And the way you do that is by using data. Using data from, for example, some of these, the PFM database that was developed, or research from the Nigerian Governors Forum, for example, to present their case to many of the politicians. And it has worked in the past. And we hope that with this approach of building coalitions around key issues of constitutional amendment would help. Another area and a key example where we have seen some improvement, but sadly that has not been taken forward, is around the state peer review mechanism. I know yesterday some speakers mentioned the African peer review mechanism. Back in 2011, we modeled the Nigerian state peer review mechanism around this African peer review mechanism. But the key focus for us at the time was essentially, this was a non-ranking mechanism to help states learn from one another, and focused around 5 areas. So information and data around PFM, policy and strategy, public service management, for example, citizens' participation in governance, and M&E. The Nigerian Governors Forum took this on together with a number of partners in Nigeria and delivered 2 reports for 2 states. But because of the political transition process around 2011, 2012, the new governors that came on board were not able to take this. But we've learned significant lessons from that process. And this is one conversation state governors, for example, are still having around how do we make sure that we learn lessons from pockets of effectiveness or islands of effectiveness where we have seen significant progress on some reforms, on service delivery, on PFM, and how we scale that to other states or replicate that in other states. That has been successful. Another innovative example, maybe I'll stop after this, is around incentive-based performance assessment of local government in Nigeria. We've had an example in a state where around PFM, where local governments, they have been incentivized to provide basic data to show examples of how expenditures have happened around budget. Mainly this is around public financial management specifically, and to show that citizens have been involved in decision making as well as budget process. What we've seen that, which has not always happened in Nigeria, is that it is possible to have a joint planning board, a joint planning mechanism between state government and local government, and better coordinate the development of basic services, better coordinate policy and strategic decision-making process, and ensure that both local government and state government, they understand and know at any given time what each level of government is doing and how they can leverage on the activities of one. That is still a work in progress, but we have seen some of this innovation. So to recap, some of the examples I've talked about, the state peer review mechanism, the incentive-based planning system and joint planning between state and local government, that is possible. The idea of building coalitions between state actors and non-state actors to ensure that we advocate jointly around constitutional amendment process, and that has been possible. We also talked about building capacity around the associations of local government or state governments, for example, to ensure that they're better able to carry out researches and support evidence-based decision-making. We've also talked about data transparency to help not just the subnationals, but to also help non-state actors, including civil society partners, to interrogate and ensure that they hold government accountable. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that enlightenment. Before we move on to our discussant, I just thought that we can have a temperature check in the room in terms of clarifications from our two presenters. I think it's been really interesting to hear, if I may, starting from Ethiopia, how indigenous do we remain in terms of the decentralization agenda, despite the many reforms, and really, as you ended, talking about the cultural foundation being still at the core of it, but also listening on to Chris of how the agenda on service delivery becomes the raison d'être for pushing for the decentralization agenda. And I think it really feeds into some of the discussions that we have had. Decentralization for what? But then I think also, Chris, you touched on many aspects of decentralization and what that means for citizens' participation. And this has really been interesting to hear, not only how information systems, which is another key point that came out, but how accountability is very important moving forward, and how capacity building for the long term, with the examples that you have shared with us from the Nigerian Governors Forum and all the way to other spaces that you talked about on monitoring, the peer review mechanism and those kind of examples. Any questions and clarifications from the room? All right. As we are digesting those, because we will have a discussion, so I hope you are taking down some questions or putting your reflections together. Just wanted to invite Steve Ogutu, who is the Executive Director and the East Africa Coordinator for the Movement for Community-Led Development here in Kenya, to just lead us on for the discussion.
Thank you so very much, and good morning, colleagues. It's really great to hear the insights that have been shared by Ketema and on the decentralization perspective in Africa. I will speak from the community-led development perspective. So when we talk about all this decentralization and broadly localization, but then where is the community in this? And listening to Chris and Ketema, they have highlighted a number of challenges and that some of them speak to the unsustainability of these processes. And therefore, the question should be, how are we ensuring that even as we talk about decentralization, that we are very inclusive, from a community perspective? It's decentralization from whose perspective? Is it from the community's perspective, or is it from the government perspective? I think once we are able to understand that, then we can begin to talk about sustainability, sustainable decentralization. One of the things that we believe in at MCLD is we cannot talk about development, sustainable development, without really talking about communities and working with them to ensure that their voices are meaningfully included in all these processes, and therefore creating ownership when it comes to these processes. From our experience also, what we have seen is, and we are doing some work in Ethiopia, Ketema, and Nigeria as well. And from our experiences, what we have seen is this decentralization debate is, or processes are largely driven by the political class. And along the way, communities are not meaningfully engaged, and therefore most of these policies that are developed to drive this agenda are very top down. And I had Ketema talking about the challenges with accountability, the downward, upward accountability, and how it's really challenging. And it's because of the mismatch. The communities are really not being included in some of these conversations. So what we are doing as MCLD is we're working with partners in all those countries, that's Nigeria included, and Ethiopia, to ensure that there is what we are calling the systems mindset change, working with various actors. And we have designed a number of tools, one of them being what we are calling the community-led development assessment tool, that then helps to look at to address the sustainability question of some of these processes and development in general. It helps to look at how, for example, do you ensure you are community-led when designing, implementing, and evaluating policies. And it's a very exciting tool. We have used it to train local governments, including in countries like Canada, and about 10 countries in Africa. And the feedback that we are getting is government officials, have, a change in mindset. They begin to look at things from bottom-up ways, as opposed to the way things have been done in a very top-down model that we have seen is actually not working. And these are some of the areas that we can be happy to continue sharing more and see how we can navigate that. One of the things that we are also very actively involved in is in driving the social accountability aspect of things. I'll share an example of, for example, what we are doing here in Kenya with the subnationals that we are working with, as well as in Ethiopia, by the way, is on working with them to set up what we are calling the community-led monitoring and evaluation platforms, where communities are really involved, from across the policy design and the implementation, of particular projects, but also just being able to measure. Most time when we measure success of these initiatives, we always look at it from the government perspective or the donor perspective. That making these partners to really pause and say, what is the success of this initiative from the community perspective, and we have tools around that can help to achieve that. An example that I'll give is with Makueni County Government, where we are working here in Kenya, and we have worked with them to set up some of those structures, village, right from the village, like the village development committees that are that just in case there is a government want to put up a road, communities are involved in a particular committee, that brings together county government officials and other development partners, and they are able to give their views, right from the design phase of the project. And they're able to look at, okay, we have dedicated this amount of funding to go into this project. I mean, how is it being spent, and that has helped to improve accountability and ownership. And those are some of the areas that we continue to push, and we hope that through some of these collaborations we can expand. We can continue expanding and making really decentralization work for all. Jamie, I don't know how much time I had. Sorry, I forgot to ask. Oh, 0. Great. But also maybe to say that we are also involved in delivering other trainings around participatory budget making processes, so that communities are able to ask the right question when it comes to these budget making processes and the accountability part of it, and aspects of citizen-led governance. How do communities really engage with the other actors? As Chris noted, we cannot talk about successful decentralization without meaningful collaborations with all actors within the development ecosystem. I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Steve. And as we open the floor, I mean, we definitely would all agree that go ahead.
Maybe just to add one last item.
That's okay. Go
about
ahead.
the school for devolution that I mentioned yesterday in under a minute. So last year, as part of institutionalizing what we have been practicing in terms of championing community-led development and devolution in general, we established what we are calling the School for Devolution and Community-Led Development, which is a joint initiative between ourselves and the county government of Makueni that is not just serving Kenya, by the way, it's serving the region as well. So we have the physical school in Makueni, but we are also offering virtual learning. And this is just one of those tools that we are availing to ensure that we meet some of these challenges around localization and decentralization. Thanks. I'm sorry about that.
It's a perfect addition, Steve. I think we cannot move away from the discussion on elevating this debate, cannot leave out who is measuring the success. And I think, like we agreed, yesterday, and that we have heard in others in the interventions shared today, that we need different tools, most definitely, in terms of not only sensitizing the population that will seek accountability from local governments, but that will also support in making some of these informed decisions, so that participation is not just, tokenism is not what is used in terms of participation, but it's actually effective engagement. And informed citizens do help in terms of, delivering effective monitoring spaces, but also in terms of contributing to what they want to see come out of decentralization policies. And I think it ties on very well to what Katema has shared on service delivery as well, but also some of the questions that have been raised, particularly from Ethiopian perspective, right? Where he asked the questions around, this policy-oriented, sector-specific and multi-level governance decentralization. While it's key and it's had a specific focus from a government perspective, it's still lacking in other areas. And also the question of being much more inclusive. So what is indeed decentralization solving, or is it part of the problem? I think this is what Katema also shared in his reflections. But now I need to stop talking and I need to listen to the audience. So let's have just yes, Augustine, would you like to kick us off? Then Nicholas, and then we take that round of comments and then we go on to the next.
Thank you very much, Chair. I must really commend our presenters and discussants. I find this very refreshing, coming from not a federal context, but really a unitary state that is also trying to decentralize. And I think the comparative experiences are quite enriching. I would like to ask particularly the presenters, Katema and our Nigerian colleague, Chris. I think Chris points out, rightly so, that decentralization is political and it's grounded in national politics. And I think when you listen to Katema, again, he concludes by highlighting one of the major challenges, lack of consensus on what decentralization, federalism, or federalization, what form must it take and all that. Now, our discussant emphasizes on community involvement, community-led involvement. These are kind of like two extremes, because when I think of national politics, I'm really thinking, where is the politician in this discussion and where is political dialogue? And I think I would be very keen to hear a bit more, both from Ethiopia and Nigeria. To what extent is the discussion around decentralization of federalism really also happening at a political level, in the sense of not in parliament, but within political parties? Because I think this is one gap that I think we kind of like experience, that a lot of issues that are very political tend to actually happen devoid of the actual political actors, or indeed the political actors themselves are far much less informed. They are not even familiar with the discussion. And of course, eventually they're given the mandate to take us through, and hence the challenges sometimes we face. Are there initiatives that are involving directly political actors in this regard, and what are the experiences?
Thank you very much. I have two comments or questions. The first one, I think any of you can answer that. It's on, the federal system. On decentralization, one expects the federal states to be more devolved, and as Chris said in his presentation, because of the differences in the states based on perhaps their geopolitical. I'm just wondering, from your experience in Ethiopia and also in Nigeria, whether you can see some innovations, either to responding to accountability issues or incentive systems that are coming from specific states because of their uniqueness, because of their other geopolitical, so they respond better. And that's the essence of, decentralization, that local people with differences should be able to respond to their needs better. And so that's the one size not fit all. So I want to find from the federal countries how they have seen decentralization compared to us, the United States, where the state policy supersedes local policies. I want to find. Now, the second one is perhaps to Chris from Nigeria. And I think it concerns what you mentioned as insecurity and the fact that extreme groups survive or thrive in areas where the local governments are weak. And I think this is where on Monday or on Sunday, we were discussing within the LPSA group alliance, that if you want to make a strong case for development partners to, to deepen decentralization, to come back to decentralization after all these years, that they appear to have set back, is to make the point that from the Sahel, for the insecurity in the Sahel, and as it's moving towards the West Coast, West Africa coast, we've seen that in Mali, where the local governments are weak, that's where the extreme groups actually push. There is also evidence in Niger. And so in the Nigerian case, do we have evidence? And as you pointed out, can you give us more information how the extreme groups were able to survive and perhaps push in areas where the local governments are weak? Is it because the local government do not exist? When you say they are weak, is it in what extent? And whether in your view, we can make this strong argument to development partners that perhaps coming back to decentralization, the focus on fragile states should be around this so that we can also perhaps take our case there. So those are my two comments.
Okupa, and after Henry.
You know, when I was a good student for professor here, there's one thing that has always stuck in my mind when we are discussing issues of decentralization. And this is what he said. Finance follows functions. Meaning that when you decentralize, you probably leave local authorities or you give them certain functions. There is always need to have an equal amount of funding that will help them perform those functions. Providing functions is not an end itself. It must be a means to an end, meaning that there is also need to have certain form of funding that will come from central government to local authority. So my question is, are there any mechanisms in Nigeria and in Ethiopia where central government is able to finance local authorities? And if indeed there is, how predictable is that funding? Remember that there are two sources of finance for local authorities, for local government. There's an external one and the internal one. So how predictable is that funding, especially the one that comes from central government?
Sorry, for me, I just was intrigued by the statement which Chris mentioned about decentralization being political and being grounded in national politics, which is largely true for most countries, that is. But then now the challenge with this statement, as much as it has a practical sense, is that we then mean that, you know, it conveys a level of helplessness insofar as the longevity and sustainability of decentralization, because what happens in a particular country with respect to decentralization is now going to be left at, you know, the level of politics that is happening at the national level, who is leading the government, what their position is on decentralization, whether they're supportive or not supportive. And the challenge with this, again, I remember the conversation by Prof yesterday, Prof Yap, relating to the Big Bang implementation of devolution and how it has had different results and outcomes for different countries. And largely what he was talking about, he mentioned that what has made a difference is that the countries where it has actually made a difference, there is an institutionalization of the rule of law. And I think it's important for us to have a conversation towards how do we institutionalize processes of decentralization in a way that we kind of find a way of shielding them, or largely shielding them from the political tensions at the national level. Because one of the things which we've also been struggling is the level and extent of decentralization that, or rather support that subnational governments receive has largely been left to whether the national government is supportive or not supportive of devolution. For example, what the Kenyan constitution did, to give an example, is that we tried as much as possible to constitutionalize a lot of things, to entrench a lot of processes in the constitution. I don't know whether this is a good thing or bad. In terms of financing, their processes, their criterias, their minimum thresholds, the institutions like independent constitutional institutions that were entrenched into the constitution for purposes of ensuring that we find a way of shielding the processes and the outcomes of decentralization from politics. So as much as they still push back from the national government, I know obviously countries that are devolved, I know we had a conversation with regarding the whole issues of concept, but decentralized countries may not have a lot to do insofar as shielding decentralization from the politics at the national level because of the very nature or the normative nature of decentralization. But countries that, for example, like Nigeria, which I was surprised to hear about the impact politics has on the federal system of government, decentralized countries may not have much to do, but countries whose systems and of decentralization are constitution-based, it's important for me to be able to understand also from the perspective of Chris, how then the politics still manage to affect the processes of decentralization, notwithstanding the constitutionalization of those processes.
Shall we go to, do you want to take it just in the first round, just to give the chance to the speakers to come back to the set, or is it connected to this set of questions?
It's kind of connected.
So please go ahead.
Thank you. So thank you very much. I just wanted to also make a follow-up on that whole issue of decentralization being a political arena. And for me, then I would like to throw it to the room with a question is that, are we talking or looking at a disenfranchised community? Because it means that we are having leaders who are governing us and we're not putting them to account. And that takes me to the discussion Stephen put forward about community engagement. Because in the true sense of the word, the people in leadership are given that power by the people. So I think it's important that as we look at elevating this debate on decentralization, we begin to interrogate the purpose for decentralization. Was it just a political governance tool where people want to be brought on board to feel involved? Or is it more than that? Because today we are talking about development, them being development as well. And so for me, I think at the end of the day, we need not just throw the back and leave it to political will and cause the worry Henry is flagging, but we need to take it a little bit more on how we can onboard the accountability issues that are driven, that are community driven. And there are examples that have been given to us. We have civic engagement platforms. He's talked about them. Places like Barazas in Uganda, where the community is given reports on performance and they get input on their kind of assessment of where it needs to go. So for me, I think we need to link the two and not just allow it to lie at the state of it is the political will. That's when we get the problems coming on.
Thank you so much for this round of questions. And just one additional question that has come through in the chat. I'll try to paraphrase it. It seems as though a one-size-fits-all in terms of universal decentralization seems to have fostered uneven service delivery. Constitutional-based decentralization covers everyone. Some are covered in honey, others covered in dirt. Any other models? So that's the question. And some examples are given. Classification. Should cities lead the way? How about creating fiscal space by empowering a few local governments that have the potential to raise revenue and then cascade down, say 20 years time before the villages are reached? That's from John Dalton joining us online. So an interesting round of questions. I know I've read very quickly, but I know that maybe we start with you, Chris, online, to just give us some of the reactions to those questions. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Very interesting questions there, I must say. Okay, let me start with the first. Well, I'll probably not answer everything or have answers to everything, but I'll attempt to. So let me start with the first one, which is about if there is dialogue, political dialogue on decentralization among political actors. And the answer is yes. In Nigeria, very much so, at different levels, at the federal level and at the subnational level. Actually, I'm due to speak on next week, Monday, on a national dialogue on the constitutional amendment that would bring in or would usher in some level of decentralization to local government, to state government. And this dialogue is cross-party based. So it's with politicians, it's with technocrats, it's with government officials, it's with civil society partners. You have speakers from professional bodies, from civil society. And this is at the national level. When the constitutional amendment process kicks off properly, we will have in different parts of the country, different levels of conversation. And this is enshrined in the constitutional amendment process. So it's taken away from the federal, but yes, we will have federal level conversation. But at the subnational level, you will have a number of this conversation. On media and in many open public spaces, this conversation is going on. So we are not left in the hands of politicians. We have open conversation and national dialogue. Just last week, we had a national dialogue, again, cross-party on policing, subnational policing in Nigeria. So we have this conversation. Again, it's not left to politicians. I heard my brother saying that the statement about decentralization being political almost leaves us helpless. But actually, no. I think what I'm saying is that we should be political in our approach. So if it is a political conversation that deals with money and politicians are engaged in the process because it's about their power, it's about the kind of resources, then on our part, we then need to be political. And what do I mean by this? Essentially identifying and working in coalitions I mentioned earlier. So we don't leave it in the hands of politicians. We come together as non-state actors, professional bodies, associations, and engage with some of these key influencers on what will take. Yes, there is a space for confrontation and the stone throwing approach of the old civil society partners where you confront government officials. There is space for that, but there is also space for dialogue. There is also space for influencing. And I think when we understand that, we then begin to, act politically in a way that would identify what some of the interests and incentives of these politicians are, and then act on it. And a clear example I would give you of what those incentives and interests are is at the national level. The federal government has seen that it cannot actually on its own deliver the security challenges in Nigeria. And he has said from the onset that, look, we must devolve policing to the subnational level. But hey, there are other politicians that are against it. So what do? You work with those actors that your interests align and identify some of these influencers that can change decisions. So it's about working politically and ensuring that you get your point across and not being helpless in that situation. That's on the first question. I think covers maybe the third question actually. In terms of innovation and how some states or subnational governments, they've been able to innovate and act outside the pack of other subnationals. Yes, we have seen that in Nigeria. And I think that's the beauty of a federal system. And also when you have, if you like, reformists in some of the locations or in some of the states in Nigeria, states begin to learn from one another. A clear example, I'll give maybe two examples for two different states in Nigeria. Lagos State, they have been able to increase their domestic revenue way more than other subnational governments in Nigeria. Of course, it's partly because it's a commercial city and we all know that. But the key really is about how the government, they have gone about it in a citizen-centric way. In fact, they have a long way to go in terms of, even collecting optimally. But what they have shown to other states in Nigeria is that it is possible. You can do it. And so what we have done with Lagos State over time is to share the lessons. In fact, we have states in Nigeria going to Lagos State to learn about how they have done or increased their domestic revenues, for example. In Kaduna State, quickly, we saw a governor who was very much interested in bottom-up approach of decision making. So he had all of these community charters with communities to develop their needs, their priorities, and have a joint planning between states and local government. Again, other states from Nigeria going to Kaduna State to learn this approach around planning and strategy between states and local government and jointly plan. So we have seen some innovation, and that is the beauty of having the Nigerian Governance Forum. Sorry. Okay. I guess I stop. Okay. I'll stop there.
Chris, we would have wanted you to be with us here in the
Thank
room
you.
because then I would say that, people could follow you during the coffee break, but the conversation could continue and I have a timer on me. Just turning on to Katema, and maybe Katema, you could take on some of the questions, for instance, the one that Mukapa has asked. And I know that's kind of putting you on the spot, but I think we've also had some questions around innovations and accountability from a federal state that Nicholas has asked, and any others that you'd feel. And if I'm allowed to give him 3 minutes. Thank you.
I thank those who asked these questions, very interesting questions. I may not have enough answers to all of them, but I would like to reflect on. Starting with Augustine's question, a very important question in relation to political dialogue and lack of consensus. This is very important currently in the Ethiopian context because we are now the process of establishing National Consensus Commission. And this commission is meant to speak to that lack of consensus and political dialogue. From the Ethiopian context, there is, broad agreement on the issue that there is lack of agreement on fundamental issues, including the constitutional framework and some of the constitutional provisions and the state to society relation. So in general, elites are very central in the consensus making in general, and political elites are specifically very critical for bringing political settlement and political roadmap for a decentralization and federalization project. This is not to overemphasize the role of politics, but it is really the real issue at hand. Not every citizen understand what politics is. It is through this business of political dialogue among the political elites representing different ethnic communities that decentralization and federalization project comes into the picture. And it is this political process, political settlements that latter leads to another dimensions of decentralization, including the constitutional framework, financial arrangements, and other dimensions and aspects of the decentralization. So we often say decentralization or federalization has got founding fathers. These founding fathers are, those who have participated, who brought the idea of decentralization for the country, and this is related to their role in consensus building and starting the decentralization process. In relation to innovation, in the Ethiopian context, this is a real problem that we have because constitutionally, some national government, local governments are expected to innovate as per the local context. But politically, it is not possible because the political accountability, partisan relationship didn't allow them. And federal government most of the time put a framework for them and they act according to that. And there is also lack of financial freedom to innovate for the local context and to respond to the pressing issues for their people. Yes. Yes, in relation to finance, sorry, Makopa, a very important question that you have highlighted. I mean, it's a kind of comment, but you have asked the issue of predictability. You know, local government and the state government in the Ethiopia context, they predominantly depend on transfers that comes from the federal government. And this transfer constitutionally is not an obligation for the federal government to even transfer to the local and subnational state. But there is a transfer, and that transfer accounts for 80% and more of the state governments, and even 90% and above for the local government. And local governments have no direct connection with the federal government, in fact, but they receive these transfers from subnational government. And there is a problem of predictability, and most of the transfers they receive is for administrative and salary reasons, and they don't have adequate fund for doing this development and other activities at local level. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you so much to Chris, Katema, and also Steve as the discussant for this session, but particularly special thanks to all who have contributed. I know there's some questions we may not have answered, but that's what coffee breaks are for. And I know that in the chat, and Chris, hoping that you can start your day fresh. But I think as we go off, something that we need to open up for this particular space as the LPSA, what do we think we can make use, how useful can this platform be on some of these rich insights? So not just listening into the best practice, but what seems to be the next steps and how can we elevate? So what do we bring into this space? What do we create out of this space to allow the different examples that have come across and the different actors to elevate that debate and contextualize it to the needs that decentralization is expected to bring along. And I think that's what we can take with us to the tea break. Thanks again, Chris, and everyone for joining us.